What if the thing that is hurting you the most right now is not a person, not a situation, not bad luck, but a memory you refuse to put down? What if you have been carrying something that already ended years ago, and your body, your mind, your entire life is still paying the price for it today? Think about this. A man burns his hand on a hot stove. The stove cools down in minutes, but the man spends the next 10 years flinching every time he walks into a kitchen. The stove is gone. The burn is healed, but in his mind it never stopped burning. Welcome to Wisdom Woven, the place where ancient wisdom meets real life. If this is your first time here, you are in the right place at the right time. And if you have been here before, you already know what we talk about here changes things. Before we go any further, please like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear this, subscribe to the channel, and drop a comment below telling us, what is one thing from your past that you still cannot let go of? That one comment could change your life. And it will help this video reach the people who need it the most. Now back to that man in his kitchen. He is not weak. He is not broken. He is doing exactly what every human being on this planet has been quietly trained to do, live in the past while standing in the present. Buddhism has a word for this kind of suffering. It is called dukkha. And unlike what most people think, dukkha does not just mean pain. It means the deep, grinding dissatisfaction that comes from clinging to what happened, to what was said, to what was lost, to who you used to be. The Buddha did not discover this sitting in a palace. He discovered it by watching people, real people, suffering in very ordinary, very human ways. He noticed something strange. People were not suffering only because of what life gave them. They were suffering because of what they refused to give back. And that is the truth nobody talks about. The past does not actually have power over you. Your relationship with the past does. There is a difference, a big one. See, the past is finished. It does not exist anywhere except inside your nervous system, inside the stories you replay before you sleep, inside the reasons you give yourself for why you cannot move forward. The past lives in you, not outside you, and that means something important. It means you are the one keeping it alive. Now that is not said to blame you, because nobody chooses to carry this weight consciously. Nobody wakes up and says, "Today I will hold onto every painful thing that ever happened to me and let it quietly destroy my peace." It happens slowly, invisibly, one small replay at a time. A harsh word from a parent, a betrayal from a friend, a failure that felt like the end, a version of yourself you could not forgive. Each one of these things, tiny on its own, slowly becomes the lens through which you see everything new. Buddhism calls this samskara. These are the invisible impressions left on the mind by past experiences. Think of them like grooves carved into stone by water. Over time, every drop follows the same path. And your mind does the same thing. It follows the same emotional grooves again and again until suffering starts to feel normal. Until the prison starts to feel like home. And here is what is quietly devastating about all of this. While you are living in 2015 inside your head, your actual life is happening right now without you. Moments are passing. People are standing in front of you. Opportunities are arriving and leaving. And you are not there for any of it because a version of you from years ago is still standing in a room that no longer exists. The Buddha said something that sounds simple but hits like a stone dropped in still water. He said, in the end, only three things matter: how much you loved, how gently you lived, and how gracefully you let go of the things not meant for you. Letting go, that is where this entire journey begins. Not in forgetting, not in pretending, not in forcing yourself to feel fine, but in something far more honest and far more powerful than any of that. And that is exactly what this video is going to walk you through, step by step, truth by truth, until something in you finally shifts. Nobody builds a prison around themselves on purpose. That is the cruelest part of it. The walls go up so slowly, so quietly, that by the time you notice them, They already feel like walls you were born inside. Here is something most people never stop to think about. Your mind does not store what actually happened to you. It stores the meaning you gave to what happened. And that small difference between the event and the meaning is where everything goes wrong. Imagine two people, same childhood, same difficult home, same absent father, same cold silence at the dinner table. One of them grows up and says, "That taught me to be strong." The other grows up and says, "That proved I was never enough." Same experience, completely opposite stories. And here is the terrifying part. Both of them will spend the rest of their lives finding evidence that their story is true. This is not a flaw in human nature. This is human nature. The mind is not built to find truth. It is built to find confirmation. Buddhism understood this long before modern psychology had a name for it. The ancient teachers called the mind chitta, not just the thinking brain, but the entire field of consciousness that collects impressions the way cloth collects dust. Every experience leaves a mark. Every mark shapes how you see the next experience. And slowly, without realizing it, you stop seeing the world as it is. You start seeing the world as you are. That is a sentence worth sitting with. You stop seeing the world as it is. You start seeing the world as you are. So what does a person do when they are carrying 10 years of hurt, 20 years of rejection, 30 years of quiet self-doubt? They walk into every new room already knowing what is going to happen. They meet new people but see old ones. They start new chapters but read from old pages. The body is present. The mind is somewhere in the past, rerunning a story that already has an ending. Buddhist monks used to describe this with an image that is both simple and slightly uncomfortable. They said the untrained mind is like a drunk elephant, enormous, powerful, crashing through everything, completely out of control, and completely unaware that it is causing damage. You are not the drunk elephant, but without awareness, without that crucial moment of stepping back and watching the mind, you are being dragged behind it. Now here is where it gets interesting. The mind does not just replay the past passively. It actively protects the past. It argues for it. It justifies it. It will find 10 reasons why the old story is still relevant, still accurate, still worth holding on to. Because the mind has a very uncomfortable relationship with uncertainty, and the past, no matter how painful, is at least familiar. Familiar pain feels safer than unfamiliar peace. Read that again slowly. Familiar pain feels safer than unfamiliar peace. That is not weakness. That is biology. The brain is wired to prefer the known over the unknown, even when the known is destroying you. Neuroscientists call this the negativity bias. The Buddha called it moha, delusion. The quiet, stubborn insistence on staying blind to what is actually happening inside you. And here is what moha looks like in real life. It looks like staying in situations that have long expired because they feel familiar. It looks like replaying old arguments in the shower and winning them years too late. It looks like meeting someone kind and spending the first 6 months waiting for them to hurt you because everyone else did. Moha is not dramatic. It is quiet. It is ordinary, and it is everywhere. The old Zen teachers had a phrase they used often, shashin, beginner's mind. The ability to enter each moment as if for the first time, without the weight of all the previous times pressing down on your perception. A beginner's mind sees possibilities. An expert's mind, one that has been hurt too many times, only sees patterns. And the saddest pattern of all is this one. People take the worst thing that ever happened to them and slowly, without realizing it, make it the most important thing about them. The wound becomes the identity. The story becomes the self. There was once a monk who kept a stone in his pocket, every single day for years. When his teacher finally asked him why, he said, "It is to remind me of the day I was humiliated. I never want to forget it." The teacher looked at him for a long moment and said, "And how is the stone working for you?" The monk went quiet, because the stone had not protected him from humiliation. It had just made his pocket heavier every day. Most people are walking around with pockets full of stones, old grievances, old failures, Old versions of themselves they decided were the real version, and the weight of those stones does not make them more prepared for the future. It just makes the present harder to breathe in. Here is what Buddhism teaches and what nobody really wants to hear. The story is not you. The story happened to you. There is a difference. A river is not the storm that once passed through it. The water keeps moving. The storm exists only in memory. Your mind became a prison not because life was cruel, although sometimes it was, but because at some point the mind decided that holding on was the same as being safe, and it was never corrected. Nobody sat you down and said, "You are allowed to put that down now." So you kept carrying it, all the way into today. That is what this part is really about. Not blame, not guilt, just the quiet, honest recognition that the prison you are sitting in has no lock on the door. The question is whether you are ready to notice that. Here is something that will quietly rearrange the way you think about your own pain. The Buddha never said life is suffering. That is the most repeated mistranslation in the history of human wisdom. What he actually said was far more precise, far more personal, and honestly, far more useful. What he said was this: suffering arises. It does not just exist. It is not the permanent condition of being alive. It arises from specific causes in specific ways through a very specific process happening inside you right now. And what can arise can also cease. That one shift in understanding changes everything about how you relate to your own past. Now most people hear the word suffering and they think of the big things: loss, betrayal, grief. But the Buddha was watching something much quieter than that. He was watching the mind add to things. He was watching the way a human being takes one painful moment and builds an entire universe of hurt around it without even realizing they are the architect. Buddhism has a word for this that almost nobody outside of Pali scholarship talks about. The word is papanka, and it means mental proliferation. The wild, uncontrolled tendency of the mind to take one thing and spin it into 1,000 things. One rejection becomes proof that you are unlovable. One failure becomes evidence that you were never capable. One cruel word from one person on one bad day becomes the voice you hear in your head for the next 15 years. That is papanka, and it is not a character flaw. It is what unguarded minds do. It is the mind's version of pulling on a loose thread until the whole sweater unravels. The Buddha described memory in a way that modern neuroscience is only now beginning to confirm. He said the mind does not retrieve the past the way you retrieve a book from a shelf, taking the same object every time unchanged. He said the mind reconstructs the past. Every single time you remember something, you are not playing back a recording. You are rebuilding it. And every time you rebuild it, you add something new: your current mood, your current fears, your current beliefs about yourself. Which means the version of the past that is haunting you right now is not even the real past. It is a story you have edited, narrated, dramatized, and re-released so many times that the original event is almost unrecognizable underneath it. There is an old Buddhist teaching called the 2 arrows. The first arrow is the painful event itself, the loss, the failure, the wound. That arrow lands and yes, it hurts. That pain is real, but it is the second arrow that does the real damage. The second arrow is everything you add to it: the self-blame, the replaying, the catastrophizing, the story of why this proves something terrible about you or your life. The first arrow is unavoidable. The second arrow, you are firing it yourself. Most people spend their entire lives treating the pain of the second arrow as if it were the first one. They keep looking outside for who shot them, not realizing the bow is in their own hands. Now here is where the Buddhist understanding of memory becomes genuinely radical. The ancient teachers were not interested in helping people feel better about their past. They were interested in something more unsettling than that. They wanted people to question whether the self that experienced the past is even the same self standing here today. This is the teaching of anicca, impermanence, not just of situations and relationships, but of the self itself. The you that was hurt at age 12 is not the you standing here now. Not biologically. your cells have replaced themselves. Not emotionally, your capacity, your perspective, your understanding has shifted. Not even neurologically, the brain you think with today is wired differently than it was then. So when you carry guilt or shame or grief for something that happened to a version of you that no longer exists, who exactly are you carrying it for? There was a woman who came to the Buddha in the deepest grief of her life. Her young son had just died and she refused to accept it. She carried his small body through the village asking everyone, "Please give me medicine to bring him back." Nobody could help her. Finally, someone sent her to the Buddha, and he looked at her with complete steadiness and said, "I will help you. Bring me a handful of mustard seeds from a home that has never known death." She went from house to house. Every home had lost someone. Every family carried its grief. By sunset, she had no mustard seeds, but she had something far more valuable. She had seen that loss was not happening to her alone. It was the nature of all things, and in that recognition, her grief did not disappear, but it transformed. That story is not about grief becoming smaller. It is about the self becoming less isolated inside its pain. The Buddhist truth about suffering and memory is not that your pain was not real. It was real, every bit of it. But the teaching asks you to look more carefully at what is happening right now, in this moment, when you call that pain into the present. What purpose is it serving? What are you hoping it will do for you? Are you keeping it alive because it protects you, or because letting it go feels like losing the only explanation you have for why your life looks the way it does? That last question is the one people tend to walk away from very quickly. Because buried underneath a lot of held pain is a very quiet, very uncomfortable contract the mind has made with itself. The contract says, if I keep remembering this, I do not have to take responsibility for what comes next. The past becomes the reason, and the reason becomes the roof you live under without ever questioning who built it. The Buddha called this tanha craving, and it is not just craving for pleasure. It is craving for certainty, craving for a fixed story, craving for a version of reality that stays still long enough for the mind to feel in control. Even if that version of reality is painful, at least it is known. At least it is yours. Letting go of the past is therefore not just an emotional challenge. It is an identity challenge. Because for many people, the past is not just something that happened to them. It is how they know who they are. And the Buddhist tradition does not tiptoe around that. It looks directly at it and says that identity is not real. Not because your experiences were not real, but because the self you built around them is far more fluid, far more open, far more alive than the story you have frozen it inside. Memory is not the enemy here. Memory is just a tool. The question is whether you are using it or whether it is using you. There is a type of pain that does not come from what happened to you. It comes from what you will not stop holding on to. And the strange thing about this kind of pain is that it feels righteous. It feels earned. It feels like the most honest thing about you, but it is quietly the most destructive thing inside you. Buddhism does not begin with the idea of letting go. It begins with something far more foundational than that. It begins with a single question. Why do we hold on in the first place? Because until you understand the why, letting go is just a nice idea you read somewhere and immediately forgot. The answer the Buddha arrived at is one of the most uncomfortable truths ever spoken aloud. We hold on not because we love the past, but because we are terrified of what we are without it. The past, no matter how painful, gives us something the present cannot immediately offer. It gives us a reason, a shape, a story that explains why we are the way we are. And the mind will choose a painful explanation over no explanation every single time. This is the teaching of Upadana. It is often translated simply as attachment, but that translation is too soft, too gentle for what it actually means. Upadana is more like clinging, the kind of clinging where your fingers are white and your arms are shaking, but you refuse to open your hands. It is not a gentle holding. It is a desperate grip on something that has already left. And here is what makes Upadana so quietly devastating. It does not just attach to good things. It attaches to pain just as readily, to grudges, to identities built around wounds, to the story of the person who wronged you, which you have kept alive, kept detailed, kept emotionally vivid, long after that person has moved on and forgotten you entirely. You preserve their damage like a photograph. They did not even keep the negative. Think about what that means for a moment. Somewhere out there is a person, maybe a parent, maybe an ex, maybe an old friend who betrayed you, living their ordinary life, sleeping well at night, eating breakfast without thinking about you. And here you are, years later, still having the argument with them in your head, still building the case, still waiting for an apology that is never arriving. They left the courtroom a long time ago. You are still giving testimony to an empty room. That is not loyalty to your own pain. That is upadana. That is the grip that has mistaken itself for strength. The Buddha identified 3 specific forms of clinging that trap people inside their past. The first is clinging to sensory experience, the craving to feel again what once felt good, or the compulsion to avoid feeling again what once felt terrible. Both of these chain you to the past equally, one through longing, one through fear. Neither one lets you stand freely in the present. The second form is clinging to views and opinions, specifically the views you formed about yourself and the world during your most painful moments. The belief that you are fundamentally unworthy, the belief that people cannot be trusted, the belief that good things do not last for people like you. These views were formed under extreme emotional conditions. They were survival conclusions, not truth conclusions, but they hardened over time into something that feels indistinguishable from reality. The third form is the deepest and the hardest one. It is clinging to the idea of a fixed, permanent self, the belief that there is a you, a solid, unchanging you who was damaged, who was wronged, who has been carrying this weight since a specific moment in a specific year. Buddhism does not say that your experiences were not real. It says that the self you believe was permanently damaged by them is not as solid or as fixed as it feels. There is a difference between having been hurt and being a hurt person. That difference is everything. A Zen story goes like this. 2 monks were walking back to their monastery after a long journey. They came to a river crossing and found a young woman standing at the edge, unable to cross because of the current. Without hesitation, the older monk lifted her and carried her across. He set her down gently on the other side, and the 2 monks continued walking. Hours passed. Finally, the younger monk could not contain himself any longer. He said, "Brother, we are monks. We have taken vows. We should not have touched that woman." The older monk turned to him and said, very calmly, "I set her down at the river. You are still carrying her." Read that again. "I set her down at the river. You are still carrying her." This is the entire teaching of attachment in one quiet exchange. The event was the same for both monks. The crossing happened. The woman was carried, but one mind put it down and kept walking. The other mind picked it up and never stopped carrying it. The weight was never in the woman. The weight was always in the clinging. Now here is what attachment to the past actually does to a life in practical, visible terms. It narrows everything. It takes the wide open field of what is possible right now and slowly fences it in with everything that went wrong before. The person who was cheated on in one relationship brings the evidence of that betrayal into every relationship that follows. Not because every new person is untrustworthy, but because the mind is still running the old case file, still collecting evidence, still preparing for a wound that already happened. This is what Buddhism means by the second arrow going deeper than the first. The original wound was finite. The clinging to the wound is infinite, or at least it feels that way until something changes. And the thing that changes is not willpower. This is important. You cannot force your hands open through sheer determination. People try this every day and it does not work. They say, "I will let go, I am letting go, I have let go," and 3 days later they are lying in bed at 2 in the morning replaying the same scene from 4 years ago. Willpower is not the key. Understanding is the key, because you cannot release what you do not fully see. The Buddha never told anyone to simply stop being attached. He showed people how to look at attachment directly, clearly, without drama, without judgment, until the mind could see for itself what the holding was costing. And in that seeing, something naturally loosened. Not because it was forced, but because the mind finally understood what it was actually gripping. Here is what attachment to the past is actually gripping. It is gripping the hope that somehow, if you hold on long enough, think about it enough, replay it enough, the past will change, that the person will apologize, that the wound will make sense, that the story will end differently than it did. This is the hidden engine behind all clinging, a secret, unspoken hope that pain can be undone by attention, that suffering can be resolved by more suffering. It cannot, it never has been, and some part of you already knows this. The root of all inner pain is not the past itself. The root is the belief that the past is still happening, that it is still alive, still relevant, still requiring your full emotional attention right now. Buddhism calls this a form of deep sleep, not physical sleep, but the sleep of a mind that has confused the echo for the original sound. The echo feels real. That is the problem. It has the same emotional weight, the same physical sensation in the chest, the same tightening in the stomach. But an echo is not the source. It is just sound bouncing off old walls. There is something you are protecting right now that you do not even realize you are protecting. It is not your reputation. It is not your relationships. It is not your future. It is a story about who you are, built mostly from your worst moments, and you are guarding it more fiercely than anything else in your life because somewhere along the way, that story became the only version of yourself you truly believe in. This is the part most people never reach, because it requires a kind of honesty that is genuinely uncomfortable, not the honesty of admitting you were hurt. That is the easier one. This is the honesty of asking, what if the self I keep defending is not as real as I think it is? What if the person I believe myself to be is mostly a collection of conclusions drawn during the worst chapters of my life? Buddhism has circled this question for over 2,000 years, and the answer it arrives at is one of the most radical ideas in the history of human thought. The teaching is called anatta. It is usually translated as no self, and the moment most people hear that, they shut down, because it sounds like nothing, like erasure, like being told you do not exist, but that is not what it means at all. What anatta actually says is this: there is no fixed, permanent, unchanging self sitting at the center of your experience. There is experience, there is awareness, there is this moment and the next one and the one after that. But the solid, consistent, defined self that you think of as you, the one with the history, the wounds, the identity, the story, that is a construction. A very convincing, very elaborate, very emotionally charged construction, but a construction nonetheless. Now, before that lands as philosophy, let it land as something more personal. Think about the self you are currently defending. Think about the version of you that says, this is just who I am. I am someone who has been abandoned. I am someone who cannot trust easily. I am someone who has been failed by the people who were supposed to love me. I am someone who tried and it did not work. All of that feels profoundly true. It feels like the most accurate autobiography ever written. But every single one of those statements is a conclusion that was drawn in pain, narrated in pain, and then quietly promoted to the status of permanent truth. The Zen teachers used to say, do not confuse the finger pointing at the moon for the moon itself. The story of who you are is the finger. Your actual self, alive, present, breathing, capable, is the moon. And most people spend their entire lives staring at the finger. Here is what defending the self actually looks like in everyday life, because it is subtle enough that most people miss it entirely. It looks like refusing to try something new because the old version of you failed at something similar. It looks like pushing people away before they can leave because the old story says they will leave anyway. It looks like reading kindness as weakness and gentleness as a warning sign, because the self you built in the hard years learned that softness gets exploited. Every single one of these behaviors is not a personality trait. It is a defense mechanism for a self that the mind believes must be protected at all costs. But protected from what? That is the question. Protected from what exactly? From being wrong about your own story, from discovering that you are more capable than your history suggests, from the terrifying possibility that the walls you built to keep pain out have also been keeping life out. There is a teaching from the Tibetan Buddhist tradition that describes the ego, the constructed self, as a castle built on sand, not built on rock, sand. And the person inside the castle spends all their time reinforcing the walls, patching the cracks, adding new defenses, never once stopping to look down and notice what the foundation is made of. The walls feel solid. The castle feels permanent. But every wave that comes in changes the ground beneath it, whether the person inside admits it or not. Your constructed self is the castle. Your past is the sand. And the waves, they are just life, continuing to move as it always has, as it always will. Now here is where this teaching becomes genuinely confronting. Most people, when they hear the idea of no fixed self, feel a quiet panic. Because if there is no fixed self, then who was wronged? Who suffered? Who deserves the apology, the acknowledgement, the justice? And this is an honest question. It deserves an honest answer. Buddhism does not say the suffering was not real. It says the one who suffered is not as fixed and permanent as the suffering made them feel. There is a difference between pain being real and pain being the final definition of who you are. You can honor the wound without building your entire house inside it. There was a monk in ancient China named Huineng who had no formal education, no temple training, no prestigious background. He ground grain for a living at the monastery. One day the head monk announced a competition. Whoever wrote the best verse demonstrating their understanding of the Dharma would become the next master. The leading scholar of the monastery wrote a beautiful verse about the mind being like a mirror that must be constantly polished to prevent dust from settling. Everyone agreed it was profound. Huineng, who could not even read, had someone read it to him. Then he had someone write his response on the wall. His verse said, "There is no mirror. Where can dust settle?" He understood something the scholar had not yet touched, that the self being polished, protected, and maintained is itself the illusion. There is nothing to polish. There is only this moment, open and clear. He became the sixth patriarch of Zen. The scholar went back to polishing his mirror. So what does a life look like when the self is less rigidly defended? It does not look like weakness. It does not look like having no preferences, no boundaries, no opinions. It looks like spaciousness. It looks like a person who can be criticized without collapsing, who can fail without becoming a failure, who can be hurt without immediately reaching for the old story as an explanation for why this always happens to them. It looks like someone who has stopped needing the past to be the loudest voice in the room. The hardest part of this teaching is accepting that the self you have been defending so faithfully, the one built from years of careful survival, years of collected evidence, years of painful conclusions, was never the enemy. It was never wrong for existing. It was built by a person who needed to make sense of things, who needed to survive, who needed a story to hold onto when everything else fell apart. That constructed self served a real purpose at a real time in a real life. The question is only this: does it still serve you now? Or has it become the thing standing between you and the life that is actually available to you? Because here is the quiet truth of it. The self you keep defending is not protecting you anymore. It stopped protecting you a long time ago. Now it is just repeating old warnings in a world that has already changed. It is a smoke alarm going off in a room where the fire burned out years ago. Loud, insistent, impossible to ignore, and completely unnecessary. Anatta is not the teaching that you do not exist. It is the teaching that you are not as small as your story. You are not the castle. You are not the sand. You are something far less fixed, far less fragile, and far more alive than any story ever written about you, including the one you have been writing yourself. The self that needs defending is always the self in fear, and fear always looks backwards. It looks at what happened. It catalogs it. It prepares for its return. But life, actual life, the kind worth living, it only ever moves in one direction. and you already know which direction that is. Everything until this point has been about understanding, and understanding matters. It matters enormously. But there is a moment in every honest conversation about the past where understanding alone hits a wall, where a person can see exactly what they are doing, exactly why they are doing it, exactly what it is costing them, and still not be able to stop. Because the gap between knowing and changing is not filled with more knowing. It is filled with practice. Quiet, consistent, unglamorous practice. This is where Buddhism stops being philosophy and starts being something you can actually use. Because the tradition that produced these teachings was never interested in producing better thinkers. It was interested in producing freer human beings. And there is a significant difference between those two things. The first practice is one of the oldest in the entire Buddhist tradition and also one of the most misunderstood. It is called Vipassana, often translated as insight meditation. But the word Vipassana literally means to see things as they really are, not as you fear they are, not as your history tells you they are, as they actually are right now in this moment. And the practice is simpler than it sounds and harder than it looks. You sit, you breathe. And instead of trying to stop thoughts about the past from arising because you cannot stop them and trying to stop them only makes them louder, you simply watch them. You notice the thought appearing. You notice the feeling it carries in the body. You notice how long it lasts. And you notice, and this is the critical part, you notice that it passes. Every single time, without exception, the thought arises, the feeling surges. And then, if you do not grab it and start building a story around it, it moves through and dissolves like a cloud passing in front of the sun. This sounds almost insultingly simple. It is not, because the habit of grabbing the thought, of immediately converting it into a story, a grievance, a case file, is one of the deepest grooves in the human mind. Sitting with Vipassana does not erase those grooves overnight, but it begins the slow work of showing the mind that it has a choice, that there is a space, however small, however brief, between the thought and the reaction. And in that space, everything is possible. The second practice is called metta, loving-kindness meditation. And before anyone dismisses this as soft or sentimental, understand what metta is actually doing beneath the surface. Metta begins with something almost everyone finds easy, sending warmth and goodwill to the people you already love. But then it moves somewhere more demanding. It asks you to send that same genuine warmth to neutral people, strangers, acquaintances, people you simply do not think about. And then, and this is where it becomes genuinely challenging, it asks you to send it to the people who hurt you. Not because they deserve it, not as a gift to them, but because the hatred, the resentment, the cold contempt you are carrying for them is not living in them. It is living in you. Every morning you wake up and carry it. Every night you take it to bed. They are not inconvenienced by your resentment. You are. Metta is not forgiveness granted to the person who wronged you. It is freedom returned to the person who has been carrying the weight of the wrong. There is a difference, a profound one. The third practice comes from Zen, and it is perhaps the most unusual one. It is the practice of koan contemplation. A koan is not a riddle with an answer. It is a question designed to exhaust the logical mind until something deeper opens up. The most famous one, what is the sound of one hand clapping, is not asking for a clever response. It is asking the mind to go somewhere logic cannot follow, because the logical mind is the same mind that maintains the story of the past. It is the mind that argues, defends, justifies, and explains. The koan breaks that machinery temporarily, and in the gap, the mind gets a taste of something it almost never experiences, pure presence, without narrative. You do not need a Zen master to work with this. You simply need a question you cannot answer with logic. A question like, who was I before the thing that hurt me decided who I was? Sit with that. Do not try to answer it. Let it work on you. The discomfort it creates is not a problem. It is the practice. The fourth practice is one that almost nobody talks about in the context of Buddhism, but is embedded in virtually every monastery tradition across Asia. It is the practice of physical mindfulness, bringing complete, unhurried attention to the most ordinary physical actions. walking, eating, washing. The reason this matters for releasing the past is subtle but important. The past lives primarily in the conceptual mind, in language, in story, in the narrative self. The body lives exclusively in the present. You cannot be fully, genuinely present in your body and simultaneously lost in thought about something that happened 3 years ago. The body is the anchor, and in traditions from Theravada to Tibetan Buddhism, the body has always been the first and most reliable doorway back to now. The fifth practice is one the Buddha taught specifically to monks who were struggling with recurring painful thoughts. He called it the substitution of the opposite. When a thought of resentment arises, not suppression, not avoidance, but a deliberate, conscious turning of attention toward its opposite. Not pretending the resentment is not there. Seeing it clearly, acknowledging it fully, and then consciously choosing to water a different seed. Because the mind is a garden and attention is the water. Whatever you water grows. Whatever you consistently ignore does not disappear immediately, but it weakens. Over time, slowly, the roots loosen. Now there is one more practice that sits above all the others in importance. It is not dramatic. It does not require a cushion or a monastery or a teacher. It requires only honesty. It is the practice of asking one question at the end of every day, not what happened to me today, but what did I bring to today from the past? What old lens did I look through? What old story did I apply to a new situation? What assumption did I carry into a conversation that was not actually about that conversation at all? This is what the Buddhist teachers called svadhyaya in the broader Indic tradition, self-inquiry, not self-criticism. Not self-improvement in the Western productivity sense. Simply honest, curious, non-judgmental observation of the patterns the mind runs, because you cannot interrupt a pattern you have not clearly seen, and you cannot clearly see a pattern you are too ashamed or too busy to look at. Here is what all of these practices share. Every single one of them is pointing at the same thing. They are all pointing at the gap, the space between stimulus and response, between memory and meaning, between what happened and what you decide it means about you and your future. The practices do not close that gap with better answers. They widen it. They create room. And in that room, the past loses its automatic authority over the present. The Buddha once described the mind in its natural, unpracticed state as a city with no gatekeeper. Everything that wants to enter, every old wound, every fearful projection, every painful memory simply walks in, sets up residence, and starts making decisions. Practice is not about building walls. It is about stationing a gatekeeper, someone who can say, I see you, I know what you are, and I am choosing whether to let you run things today. That gatekeeper is not a technique. It is awareness. Awareness cultivated through practice until it becomes the default state rather than a special occasion. One thing must be said clearly here because it is the thing most people get wrong when they encounter these practices for the first time. These practices are not shortcuts. They are not hacks. They will not rewrite 10 or 20 years of mental habit in a single weekend retreat. The monks who developed these teachings sat with them for years, decades, not because the practices were complicated, but because the conditioning being unwound was deep. Honest practice asks for patience. Not the resigned patience of someone who has given up. The active patience of someone who knows that real change moves at the speed of understanding, not at the speed of wanting. And here is something quietly encouraging about all of it. You do not need to be perfect at any of these practices for them to begin working. You just need to be consistent. A few minutes of genuine vipassana every morning is worth more than a weekend of forced spiritual performance. A single moment of real metta towards someone who hurt you, even if it lasts only 5 seconds before the resentment floods back in, is a genuine crack in the wall. Small cracks matter. They are how light eventually gets in. There is a story of a monk who asked his teacher, "How long will it take before I am free from my past?" The teacher said, "How long have you been practicing?" The monk said, 3 months. The teacher said, "Then you have been free for 3 months." The monk did not understand. The teacher smiled and said, "Freedom is not the end of the path. It is what the path is made of." Every step taken in awareness is a step not taken in the past. That is not poetic. That is literal. Every moment you spend genuinely present, genuinely here, breathing, noticing, feeling the ground beneath your feet, is a moment the old story did not get. And over time, those moments accumulate into something the mind could not have imagined at the beginning of the practice. They accumulate into a different life. There is a moment that does not announce itself. It does not arrive with dramatic music or a sudden revelation or a feeling of light breaking through clouds. It arrives quietly, ordinarily, sometimes in the middle of a completely unremarkable Tuesday. And in that moment, something that used to hurt simply does not. Not because it was forgotten, not because it was resolved, but because somewhere between the first breath of awareness and this particular moment, the weight of it finally became lighter than the life waiting on the other side of it. That moment is available to you, not someday, not after you have figured everything out. Now, in the same life you are already living, inside the same story you have been telling yourself, there is a door, and it has been there the entire time. But before we talk about walking through it, something honest needs to be said. Something the spiritual world often glosses over in its eagerness to make people feel better quickly. Letting go is not a single event. It is not a decision you make once on a quiet morning and then carry forward permanently unchanged. It is something you choose again and again and again. Some days it is easy. Some days it costs you everything you have. And some days you will pick the old story back up, carry it for a while, and then have to put it down again. That is not failure. That is the actual shape of genuine change in a human life. Anyone telling you otherwise is selling something. The Buddha spent 45 years teaching after his enlightenment. 45 years of the same essential truths, spoken in different ways, to different people, in different seasons of their lives. Because he understood that hearing something once is almost never enough. The mind needs to encounter the truth repeatedly, from different angles, under different conditions, before it stops arguing and starts listening. So if you have arrived at the end of this video still carrying something, that is not a sign that none of this worked. It is a sign that you are human, and that the work is real, and that it continues beyond the last minute of any video. Now here is what the final letting go actually looks like, and it is perhaps the most unexpected thing about it. It does not look like erasing the past. The past happened. It is written into your body, your nervous system, your memory, your way of moving through a room. You do not erase that. You do not transcend it. You do not perform a spiritual bypass where you skip over the pain and arrive suddenly in the light. You bring it with you, but differently. You stop letting it lead and start letting it inform. There is a version of the past that destroys the present. And there is a version of the past that deepens it. The difference between those two versions is not what happened. It is the relationship you have chosen to have with what happened. Buddhism calls the person who has made this shift a bodhisattva in the fuller sense of the word. Not a saint, not someone beyond ordinary life, but someone who has turned their suffering into wisdom and their wisdom into compassion. Someone whose wounds, instead of closing them off from the world, have cracked them open toward it. The person who has lost greatly and therefore meets another person's loss with genuine understanding. The person who has failed deeply and therefore sits with another person's failure without flinching. That is not despite the past. That is because of it, because of what was done with it. There is an ancient Japanese art called kintsugi. When a ceramic bowl breaks, instead of throwing it away or hiding the cracks, the artist repairs it with gold. The cracks become the most beautiful part of the object. The history of the breaking becomes the source of its value. The bowl does not pretend the breaking never happened. It wears it luminously, honestly, without shame, and it becomes more precious for having been broken than it ever was when it was whole. You are the bowl. The past is the breaking, and the gold is what you choose to fill the cracks with from this moment forward. Now let us talk about what starting over actually requires, because the phrase starting over is one of the most misused phrases in the English language. It implies going back to the beginning, wiping the slate clean, becoming someone without a history, but you cannot start over. And honestly, you would not want to if you understood what it would cost you. What you can do is something far more powerful. You can start from here. From this exact moment, with this exact history, with these exact cracks and this exact accumulated weight of everything you have been through, and choose what direction you face from this point forward. The Buddhist teaching on this is delivered through the concept of pratityasamutpada, dependent origination, the idea that nothing arises independently. Every moment is shaped by everything that came before it, including you, including this moment right now. You are not separate from your past, you are the flowering of it, and a flower does not resent the soil it grew from even when the soil was difficult. It simply grows upward, toward light. That is the only direction available, and it is enough. Here is something that nobody tells you about the people who have genuinely made peace with their past. They do not walk around radiating contentment like a television advertisement for meditation. They are not free from difficulty. They still have bad days. They still feel the old ache sometimes when something familiar triggers something old. But the difference is this: they are no longer surprised by it. They no longer treat the presence of pain as evidence that they have failed. They have developed what the Tibetan teachers call equanimity, not the absence of feeling, but the steady ground beneath all feeling, the ability to feel everything without being defined by anything. That steadiness is not a personality trait you are born with. It is something built, one conscious moment at a time, one honest practice at a time, one deliberate choice at a time, until it becomes the foundation you stand on rather than the destination you are trying to reach. Think about the oldest trees you have ever seen, the ones that have survived decades of storms, droughts, hard winters, and harsh summers. They are not smooth. They are gnarled and scarred and asymmetrical in ways that a young tree is not, but they are also the ones with the deepest roots. The storms did not weaken them. The storms built the root system that lets them stand when nothing else around them can. Your past, every difficult season of it, has been building your roots. The question is only whether you will finally stand in what they have made possible. There is one last Buddhist teaching that belongs at the end of this conversation more than anywhere else. It comes from the Dhammapada, one of the oldest recorded collections of the Buddha's words. It says, "What you think, you become. What you feel, you attract. What you imagine, you create." 3 lines, thousands of years old, and still the most precise description of why the past has so much power and why the present has so much more. What you think, you become. If every morning the first thought is an old grievance, an old wound, an old version of yourself, that is the self you are continuously creating, not because the universe is punishing you, but because attention is creative. Whatever you consistently place your attention on, you are quietly building more of. The monks understood this not as spiritual law but as practical reality. Where the mind goes, the life follows. So here is the invitation that closes this entire conversation. Not a command, not a prescription, an invitation. Tomorrow morning before the old thoughts arrive, and they will arrive, they always do, take one breath, just one. And in that breath ask yourself a single question, not what happened to me, not what went wrong, not what I am still carrying. Ask, who am I when I am not defined by any of that? Sit with the question. Do not rush toward an answer. Let the question do its quiet work. Because the answer to that question is not in your past. It never was. It is in the next moment you choose to inhabit fully, honestly, and without apology. You are not your history. You are what is aware of your history. And awareness, pure, open, present awareness, has never been wounded. It has never been betrayed. It has never failed. It was here before the story began. And it is here now in this moment, waiting patiently for you to remember it. The past is not your enemy. It is your teacher. But like all good teachers, there comes a point where it has given you everything it has to give. And the most respectful thing you can do for yourself, for the teacher, for the life still waiting ahead of you, is to take what you have learned, bow gently, and walk forward. That is the final letting go, not dramatic, not sudden, just a turning, a quiet, deliberate, deeply personal turning toward what is alive in you right now. And if this video stirred something in you, if even one sentence landed somewhere real, then please do not let it stop here. Like this video so more people can find it. Share it with someone who is quietly carrying more than they should. Subscribe to Wisdom Woven, because this is just one conversation in a much longer one. And leave a comment below. Tell us what you are ready to put down. Not because we need to know, but because saying it out loud, even in a comment box, is sometimes the first real act of letting go. The weight you have been carrying was never meant to be permanent. It was meant to teach you. And now you have learned enough to set it down.